Blake Simmons was 37 years old and spent most nights repairing broken HVAC systems inside St. Vincent Medical Center in Denver. People who saw him thought he was just another exhausted maintenance worker whose wife had outgrown him years ago. They saw the faded blue uniform, the cracked Ford Ranger, the plastic lunchbox with masking tape on the lid. What they didn't know was that Blake had been quietly collecting evidence for nearly 6 years. Bank transfers, tuition payments, emails, dash cam footage. The courtroom smelled like old paper and burnt coffee when Blake stepped through the doors that morning. Then he looked up and saw his wife sitting beside Derek Mercer at the plaintiff's table. Natalie Harper Simmons adjusted her attorney badge, opened a legal folder, and prepared to sue her own husband. Before we continue, drop your country and local time in the comments. I always like seeing where people are watching from. And if you enjoy slow burn stories about betrayal, patience, and quiet revenge, subscribe to the channel now. Tomorrow's story might hit even harder. 7 years earlier, before the lawsuits before the courtroom, before Natalie Harper learned how to stand in front of a judge and speak like she belonged there, she worked the breakfast shift at a cafe called Mountain Grind in Colorado Springs. That was where she met Blake Simmons. Blake came in every Thursday at 5:40 in the morning wearing steel-toe boots and carrying the smell of Freon and machine oil from overnight HVAC repair jobs. He always ordered the same thing: black coffee, bacon burrito, extra napkins. Natalie noticed him because he tipped even when he looked broke. Blake noticed her because she read law textbooks behind the counter between customers. At the time, Blake was 30, quiet, broad shoulders, rough hands, the kind of man people overlooked because he never tried to impress anyone. He rented a small duplex near South Academy Boulevard and drove a 12-year-old Ford Ranger with a driver's side door that groaned every time it opened. Natalie was different then. She wore cheap sneakers with holes near the laces. She tied her blonde hair back with rubber bands from the cafe register. She talked fast when she got excited, especially about law school. Someday she told Blake one snowy morning, "I'm getting out of this place." Blake remembered the way her eyes looked when she said it. Not arrogant, hungry. 3 years later, they got married at the El Paso County Courthouse with 12 people in attendance and a grocery store cake that leaned slightly to one side because the frosting melted in the August heat. 2 months after the wedding, Natalie got accepted into the University of Denver Sturm College of Law. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Blake came home from work and found Natalie crying at the kitchen table. For 1 second, he thought something terrible had happened. Then she handed him the envelope. He read the words twice: admission offered. Natalie covered her mouth with both hands. "We can't afford this." Blake looked at the tuition estimate. The number sat on the page like a punch to the throat. He had less than $4,000 in savings. Natalie started talking immediately, fast, nervous, already giving up before the dream fully existed. "I can defer for a year, or maybe I could stay here and no," Blake said, just one word: quiet, solid. Natalie looked at him. Blake folded the letter carefully and placed it back into the envelope like it was fragile. "We'll figure it out." And Blake Simmons did what men like him often do. He went to work. Then he found more work. Within 4 months, Blake was living on a schedule that would have broken most people. From 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., he worked HVAC maintenance at St. Vincent Medical Center in Denver. From 7 a.m. until 10 a.m., he loaded delivery trucks for FedEx at a distribution center near Aurora. On Saturdays, he repaired residential air conditioning systems for a local contractor named Pete Callahan. Sunday mornings, he washed cars behind a dealership off Colfax Avenue for cash. He slept in fragments, 2 hours in the afternoon, 90 minutes inside his truck between shifts, sometimes 20 minutes in the hospital locker room with his jacket folded under his head. His body started changing, dark circles under his eyes. a constant ache in his knees, hands cracked from chemicals and winter air. But every month tuition payments went through on time. Every semester Natalie got new textbooks. Every exam fee got paid. Blake stopped buying almost everything for himself. He canceled cable, sold his old Harley-Davidson motorcycle, stopped eating lunch outside work because vending machine crackers were cheaper. One winter, the heating in their duplex failed for 6 days. Blake repaired the unit himself after midnight because they couldn't afford replacement parts. Natalie studied beside a portable space heater wrapped in blankets, while Blake worked on frozen pipes in the crawl space underneath the building. Back then, she still thanked him. Back then, she still waited awake when he came home. She used to rub lotion into the cracks on his hands while reading case law aloud from her laptop. Blake never understood most of the legal terms, but he listened anyway, because she sounded happy. By Natalie's second year in law school, things began shifting in ways Blake couldn't fully explain. The changes arrived quietly. First came the clothes. The old jeans disappeared. Then came tailored coats, leather boots, designer handbags purchased during student networking events. Then came the language. Natalie stopped saying our money. It became my career, my future, my colleagues. The apartment downtown where her classmates gathered after lectures became a place Blake rarely saw. At first he blamed the workload. Law school consumed people. That was normal. But then small details began stacking on top of each other. Natalie stopped answering calls during evenings. She started locking her phone. When Blake picked her up one rainy night outside campus, she hesitated before introducing him to her classmates. "This is my husband Blake," she said quickly. One of the men shook Blake's hand while staring at his oil-stained work jacket. "What do you do, maintenance?" The conversation died instantly. Blake noticed Natalie looking embarrassed. That part stayed with him longer than he expected. Still, he kept working, because promises mattered to him, because he believed exhaustion had an end point. Because every time he wanted to stop, he remembered Natalie sitting behind that cafe counter years ago, dreaming about becoming something bigger than her life. Then came the winter Blake sold the last expensive thing he owned, his father's watch, a silver Omega Seamaster from 1978. The pawn shop gave him $2,300. Natalie's bar exam prep course cost $2,100. Blake paid for it in cash. That same night, Natalie came home after midnight smelling like expensive perfume and steakhouse smoke. She kicked off her heels near the couch and dropped her handbag onto the kitchen counter. Blake was sitting there half asleep with a microwave burrito growing cold beside him. "You waited up?" she asked. "Wanted to make sure you got home safe?" Natalie smiled, faintly distracted already. She disappeared into the shower. Blake cleaned the kitchen while she was upstairs. That was when he found the receipt. Guard and Grace Steakhouse, downtown Denver, table for 2, ribeye, wine, dessert. Total $487.16. Blake stared at the number for a long time. Then he quietly folded the receipt and slipped it into his pocket instead of throwing it away. Blake Simmons did not confront Natalie about the receipt the next morning. He didn't slam it onto the kitchen counter, didn't demand explanations, didn't search through her phone while she slept. That was not how Blake handled problems. At 4:15 a.m., he folded the receipt carefully and placed it inside an old manila folder in the garage beside warranty papers and HVAC invoices. Then he left for work. Snow drifted across Interstate 25 while Blake drove toward St. Vincent Medical Center with black coffee balanced between his knees. Denver looked gray and frozen under the early morning sky. Most people inside the hospital barely noticed him. Doctors walked past carrying tablets and coffee cups worth more than Blake spent on lunch in a week. Travel nurses complained about parking. Administrators talked about expansion budgets. Meanwhile, Blake climbed through mechanical rooms and boiler corridors, fixing systems that kept the building alive. He liked it that way. Machines made sense. People didn't. 3 nights after finding the receipt, Natalie finally mentioned the dinner herself. They were sitting in the duplex kitchen around midnight. Blake had just come home from his FedEx shift. His shoulders hurt from loading freight crates. Natalie was typing on her laptop while eating takeout salad from an expensive restaurant downtown. Oh, she said casually, not looking up that dinner the other night, was networking for the firm recruitment event. Blake opened the refrigerator. Nothing inside except egg sandwich meat and energy drinks. Must have been a good event, he said. Natalie shrugged. That's how law works. Connections matter. Blake nodded once. Then he made himself scrambled eggs in silence. Natalie kept talking. There were investors there, partners, business owners. You can't build a legal career without relationships. Blake never asked who paid the bill. Natalie seemed almost disappointed by that. Instead, he finished eating, washed his plate, and quietly took a photo of the receipt later that night before storing it in the folder. The folder got a label the next day. Repair invoices. Simple, forgettable. Nobody would ever look twice at it. Weeks passed. The tension in the house changed shape. It stopped feeling like arguments waiting to happen. It became distance. Natalie started spending more nights in Denver instead of Colorado Springs, claiming study groups and networking mixers kept running late. Sometimes Blake woke up at 2 a.m. and realized her side of the bed was still untouched. Other times she came home smelling like hotel soap and expensive cologne that didn't belong to Blake. Still, he said nothing, because part of him kept hoping exhaustion was making him paranoid. Then Derek Mercer entered the picture. The first time Blake heard the name was during a Saturday dinner Natalie barely attended mentally. She kept checking her phone while pushing pasta around her plate. Derek Mercer might sponsor the Student Legal Society fundraiser, she said suddenly. Blake looked up. Who's Derek Mercer? He owns Elevate Performance Club downtown. The gym. It's more than a gym. Natalie almost smiled. It's for athletes, executives, influencers, people with money. Blake drank water slowly. And why is he sponsoring law students? He invests in startups and legal connections. Blake nodded. Then Natalie added casually, he's actually really smart. The way she said it stayed with him. Not admiration exactly. Interest. A week later, Blake finally saw Derek Mercer in person. Natalie invited Blake to a charity mixer at a hotel near Union Station. She almost sounded obligated when she asked, You should come this time. Blake wore the only blazer he owned. Dark gray, slightly tight around the shoulders now. The ballroom inside the Crawford Hotel glowed with soft gold lighting and expensive whiskey conversations. People shook hands while discussing firms' venture capital and political donors. Blake felt out of place within minutes, not because anyone openly insulted him, because they looked through him. Natalie drifted naturally toward groups of attorneys and investors, while Blake stood near the bar nursing club soda. Then Derek Mercer walked into the room, 6'2", perfect haircut, tailored navy suit, the kind of smile practiced in mirrors. People noticed him instantly. Blake watched Natalie notice him too. Derek approached their group with easy confidence. Natalie Harper, he said warmly, future top attorney. Natalie laughed harder than the joke deserved. Then she turned toward Blake. This is my husband, Blake. Derek shook Blake's hand firmly. Good to meet you, man. Blake noticed Derek's watch first, Rolex Submariner. Probably 15 grand. Then the cufflinks. Then the polished confidence of a man who had never worried about rent in his life. What line of work are you in? Derek asked. HVAC maintenance. Derek smiled politely. Hard work. Blake returned the smile once, usually. That was the entire conversation, but Blake saw the difference immediately. When Natalie looked at Derek, she leaned slightly forward, interested, engaged. When she looked at Blake later that night during the drive home, Her eyes seemed tired. The next month, her phone changed passwords twice. She started taking calls on the balcony. Her laptop remained closed whenever Blake entered the room. One Thursday night, Blake came home unexpectedly early after a canceled repair job. Natalie was in the shower upstairs. Her phone vibrated across the kitchen counter. The screen lit up. Derek Mercer. Blake stared at the name. The message preview appeared for less than 2 seconds. Had a great time tonight. Blake looked away before the screen went dark again. When Natalie came downstairs 20 minutes later, Blake was sitting at the table drinking coffee. "You're home early," she said carefully. "Job got canceled." Natalie nodded too quickly. "You look tired. Long week." She picked up her phone immediately. Blake noticed how fast she checked the screen. That night, after Natalie fell asleep facing the wall, Blake sat alone in the garage beside stacks of tools and unopened mail. He opened the repair invoices folder. Inside were receipts, photos, tuition records, bank statements. At first he had only kept them because something felt wrong. Now he kept them because he no longer trusted memory alone. People rewrote history when guilt entered the room. Paper didn't. Over the next several weeks, Blake's routine changed quietly, not outwardly. He still worked, still paid bills, still transferred money toward Natalie's tuition balance, still fixed the leaking sink when she mentioned it. But he started observing more carefully. Dates, times, patterns. He installed a new dash cam in the Ford Ranger after an insurance discount flyer arrived in the mail. He began saving bank notifications instead of deleting them. One Friday night around 12:40 a.m., Blake drove through downtown Denver after finishing an emergency HVAC repair near Capitol Hill. That was when he saw Natalie's car, parked outside Elevate Performance Club. The gym should have been closed. Its front windows were dark, except for lights near the private training area upstairs. Blake parked across the street without fully deciding to. Snowflakes drifted against the windshield. He checked the clock. 1:07 a.m. Part of him almost drove away immediately. Another part stayed still. At 1:13 a.m., the gym door opened. Natalie stepped outside wearing the same cream-colored coat she had claimed was at a study session. Derek Mercer followed behind her. He laughed at something she said. Then he touched the side of her face with one hand before leaning closer. Blake's dash cam recorded everything in silence. Blake kept both hands on the steering wheel. Didn't move. Didn't breathe much either. Across the street, Natalie smiled at Derek in a way Blake had not seen in years. Then Derek kissed her, slowly, comfortably, like it wasn't the first time. Blake stared through the windshield while snow melted against the glass. The timestamp blinked quietly in the corner of the recording. 1:13 a.m. Blake Simmons stayed parked across from Elevate Performance Club for another 11 minutes after Derek Mercer kissed his wife. The engine idled softly beneath him. Snow gathered along the edges of the windshield. Across the street, Natalie laughed at something Derek said before climbing into her Lexus. Derek touched the roof of the car as she pulled away, casual and familiar. Blake watched the taillights disappear into downtown Denver traffic. Then he shifted the truck into drive and headed toward Interstate 25 without ever stepping outside. No confrontation, no screaming, no dramatic scene in the parking lot. That part mattered later, because Blake remembered every decision he made that night. The dashboard clock read 1:42 a.m. when he stopped at a gas station near Aurora. He bought black coffee and stood beside the truck, while freezing wind cut through his work jacket. His reflection in the gas station window looked older than 37. Tired eyes, grease beneath his fingernails, a man slowly being erased from his own marriage. Inside the truck, the dash cam footage sat saved automatically on a memory card no bigger than a fingernail. Blake stared at the camera for a long moment before driving home. When he entered the duplex, Natalie was already there. Shower running upstairs, bedroom light glowing beneath the door. She had beaten him home by less than 15 minutes. Blake stood quietly in the kitchen while water moved through the pipes overhead. Then he walked to the coffee maker. He filled it for the morning like he always did. Natalie came downstairs wearing gray sweatpants and one of Blake's old t-shirts from years earlier. For 1 second, seeing that shirt nearly broke him more than the kiss had, because it reminded him of the woman she used to be. "You're home late?" she said casually. "Emergency repair at the hospital." Natalie nodded while drying her hair with a towel. "I'm exhausted." Blake looked at her, at the woman he had worked 7 years to support, at the law student whose dreams had become more expensive every semester, at the wife who still wore his old shirt while lying to his face. "You eat yet?" Blake asked. Natalie blinked once, almost surprised by the question. "No, I made chili yesterday, still in the fridge. Thanks." That was all. No accusation, no tension in his voice. Natalie microwaved food while scrolling through her phone. Blake sat at the kitchen table pretending to review hospital maintenance schedules. Twice, Natalie smiled faintly at messages on her screen. Blake noticed. He noticed everything now. The next morning, he left before sunrise for his FedEx shift. Snow crunched beneath his boots in the apartment parking lot. His knees ached from lack of sleep. While loading freight containers, Blake replayed the parking lot scene in his head over and over. Not the kiss. The expression on Natalie's face before it happened. Relaxed, happy, free. He realized she looked more alive with Derek Mercer than she had looked with him in years. That thought followed Blake for weeks. Life continued anyway. Bills arrived, tuition payments processed, HVAC systems broke down inside the hospital. One elderly patient thanked Blake for fixing the heating in her room during a January cold snap. She squeezed his rough hand and called him a good man. Blake smiled politely. Then he went back to replacing compressors in the mechanical wing. At home, Natalie drifted further away, in small, measurable ways. She stopped asking about his shifts, stopped waiting for him at night, stopped touching him casually when passing through rooms. Even her language changed. One evening, Blake came home carrying groceries and found Natalie on a Zoom call discussing mock trial preparation. She muted herself when she noticed him. "Can you keep it down?" she asked. Blake set the grocery bags quietly on the counter. "Sure." Natalie glanced at the bags. "You bought generic again. It was cheaper." She sighed softly. "We don't have to live like this forever, Blake." He looked at her. "We live like this because your tuition's due next week." Natalie's jaw tightened immediately. "You don't have to throw that in my face." Blake stared at her for 2 seconds before nodding once. Wasn't trying to. But that wasn't true entirely. Not anymore. A few days later, Blake picked Natalie up from campus after her car battery died in freezing weather. The law building glowed against the dark Denver evening, while students in expensive coats hurried toward parking garages. Natalie climbed into the truck, looking irritated. "This thing smells like coolant, probably because I transport coolant." She rolled down the window slightly despite the cold. Halfway home, Natalie's phone buzzed repeatedly in her lap. Derek Mercer. The name flashed twice before she silenced it. "You can answer," Blake said calmly. "It's just business stuff." Blake kept his eyes on the road. At a red light near Spear Boulevard, he glanced sideways and noticed Natalie had angled the phone screen away from him completely. That tiny movement hurt more than he expected. People only hid things they already knew were wrong. Later that week, Blake sat alone in the garage organizing the folder again. Only now it wasn't one folder anymore. It had become sections: tuition, joint account statements, receipts, photos, video. He bought a small external hard drive from Best Buy using cash and transferred copies onto it after work one night. The drive fit inside a metal toolbox beneath spare furnace parts in the basement. Blake never fully admitted to himself why he was doing it. Not yet. Maybe because deep down he understood where all this was heading. Or maybe because after years of physical labor he trusted evidence more than emotions. Machines failed for reasons. People lied about reasons. Around that time, Natalie started spending weekends downtown more often. Study prep, networking brunch, firm events. The explanations rotated constantly. One Saturday morning, Blake came home after repairing an HVAC unit in Boulder. His boots were wet with slush. Exhaustion sat heavy inside his chest. Natalie stood in front of the bedroom mirror adjusting earrings. Black dress, high heels, expensive perfume. "You heading somewhere?" Blake asked. Natalie avoided his eyes while fastening a bracelet. "Fundraiser." "Today?" "Yes." Blake nodded slowly. Then he noticed the dress tag hanging partially beneath the zipper. Still new. He recognized the boutique logo immediately because he had seen the charge on their joint account statement 2 days earlier. $700. Almost exactly what Blake earned after taxes from one entire FedEx shift. "You look nice," he said quietly. Natalie paused. For a brief second, guilt flickered across her face. Then it vanished. "Thanks." After she left, Blake sat alone at the edge of the bed, staring at the indentation her suitcase wheels had left in the carpet. The apartment felt strangely silent without her. Not peaceful. Empty. He opened the closet looking for extra blankets and accidentally knocked over a leather tote bag Natalie rarely used. Its contents spilled onto the floor. Makeup, charging cables, receipts, a hotel key card, the Halcyon Denver Cherry Creek, room 1814. Blake picked it up carefully. The card felt cold in his hand. He stared at it for a long time. Then he walked to the garage, opened the folder, and added it beside the steakhouse receipt and dashcam screenshots. The collection kept growing. Not because Blake wanted revenge, because every lie Natalie told seemed to leave physical evidence behind like fingerprints. That night, snow fell heavily across Denver. Blake sat in his truck outside St. Vincent Medical Center before starting another overnight shift. Inside the cab, the heater rattled weakly. His phone screen lit up with a banking notification. Joint account purchase, Elevate Performance Club, $2,300. Blake read the number twice. Membership renewal, personal training package, or something else entirely? He leaned back slowly in the driver's seat while snow covered the hood of the old Ford Ranger. Then, for the first time since finding the receipt, Blake Simmons stopped asking himself whether Natalie was cheating. Instead, he started wondering how long it had truly been happening. Natalie Harper Simmons became an attorney on a cold Monday morning in downtown Denver. The ceremony took place inside a packed courtroom near the Colorado State Capitol. Rows of polished wooden benches filled with families, holding flowers, cameras, and pride stretched toward the back wall. Blake Simmons stood near the last row wearing a charcoal button-up shirt he had ironed himself at 4 a.m. before leaving for work. The collar sat slightly crooked. One cuff button was cracked. His steel-toe boots were hidden beneath dark slacks because they were the only black shoes he owned. He looked out of place among tailored suits and polished leather briefcases. But Blake didn't care about that. Not today. Because despite everything that had changed between them, part of him still remembered the girl from Mountain Grind Cafe. The one who studied constitutional law between coffee orders. The one who used to fall asleep on his shoulder while reading casebooks. Natalie stood near the front of the courtroom beside dozens of other newly licensed attorneys. Black robe, blonde hair pinned neatly back, calm expression. She looked different now, sharper, controlled, like she had slowly learned how to remove every rough edge from herself. The judge administered the oath while families raised phones to record the moment. Blake watched Natalie repeat every word carefully. "I will support the Constitution. Her voice stayed steady. Blake felt something tighten quietly in his chest. Pride mixed with exhaustion. 7 years, 4 jobs, thousands of hours. Every missed holiday, every overnight shift, every frozen morning loading FedEx trucks before sunrise. All of it had led here. When the ceremony ended, applause filled the courtroom. People hugged. Champagne bottles opened in the hallway outside. Natalie immediately became surrounded by classmates, law professors, and recruiters from Denver firms. Blake stayed near the wall, holding a small bouquet of white lilies he had bought at Safeway before work. He waited patiently for an opening to approach her. Twice Natalie looked directly at him. Twice she turned back toward conversations before he could move closer. Eventually she made her way over. "You came," she said. Blake handed her the flowers. "Course I did." Natalie smiled politely. Not warmly, politely. The difference hurt more than Blake expected. "You didn't have to buy these. They were $12. I survived." Natalie laughed softly, distracted already by movement behind Blake. Blake turned. Derek Mercer approached through the crowd, wearing a tailored navy overcoat over an expensive gray suit. He carried a bouquet 3 times larger than Blake's. White roses, orchids, professional florist arrangement. People moved naturally around Derek the way they moved around wealth. Confident smiles, easy conversations. Natalie's entire posture changed when she saw him. She straightened slightly, eyes brighter, energy different. "Congratulations, Counselor," Derek said smoothly before kissing her cheek. Blake watched the gesture carefully. Too comfortable, too familiar. Derek finally acknowledged Blake standing there. "Blake, good to see you again, man." Blake nodded once. "You too." Derek glanced toward Natalie with admiration that felt almost public now. "You're gonna kill it out there." Natalie smiled at him in that same relaxed way Blake had seen outside Elevate Performance Club, the smile she no longer gave her husband. A photographer passed nearby offering group photos. Natalie immediately stepped toward Derek and several classmates. Nobody asked Blake to join. He stood near the wall alone while cameras flashed across the hallway. One of Natalie's law school friends approached him awkwardly a few minutes later. "You must be really proud." Blake looked toward Natalie, laughing beside Derek. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I am." But even as he said it, he realized something had shifted permanently. Natalie no longer looked at him like a partner who helped build her future. She looked at him the way successful people sometimes look at old apartments they used to live in. Necessary once, embarrassing later. That afternoon, Blake drove back to St. Vincent Medical Center for another overnight maintenance shift while Natalie celebrated downtown. His phone remained silent all evening. Around midnight, he took a break inside the boiler room and checked social media for the first time in months. Photos from the ceremony had already appeared online. Natalie smiling beside classmates. Natalie holding champagne. Natalie beside Derek Mercer at a rooftop bar overlooking downtown Denver. Blake stared at the screen for several seconds before locking the phone again. Then he returned to work. 3 weeks after becoming licensed, Natalie accepted a junior associate position at a litigation firm called Barrett and Klein LLP near Lodo. The salary wasn't huge yet, but the status mattered. Everything about her life accelerated after that. New clothes arrived constantly, hair appointments, networking dinners, cocktail events. Blake barely saw her anymore except during rushed mornings when she drank coffee while checking emails. One Thursday night, Blake came home after replacing an industrial cooling motor at the hospital. His back hurt badly enough that climbing the apartment stairs felt slow. Inside the duplex, he immediately noticed something strange. Half the closet was empty. Natalie's winter coats were gone. Several shoeboxes missing, too. Blake stood silently in the bedroom for almost a minute before hearing movement in the living room. Natalie sat on the couch beside packed luggage, 2 large suitcases, a leather carry-on, her law degree framed near the wall waiting to be taken down. "You going somewhere?" Blake asked. Natalie looked up carefully. "We need to talk." Blake stayed standing. That phrase usually meant damage already done. Natalie folded her hands together. "I signed a lease downtown." The room felt very quiet after that. Outside, snow slid softly across the duplex windows. "For work?" Blake asked. Natalie hesitated just long enough. "For space." Blake nodded once. "How long? I don't know." She looked almost annoyed by his calmness. "I just think we've become different people." Blake leaned against the kitchen counter, slowly, exhaustion pressing through his body. Different people. Interesting phrase. Because Blake still felt like the same man who worked himself nearly to death paying her tuition. Natalie continued speaking carefully, almost rehearsed. "You deserve someone who understands your world." Blake nearly smiled at that. His world. The overnight shifts. The second jobs. The exhaustion that financed hers. "I never stopped understanding yours," he said quietly. Natalie looked away immediately. That told him enough. The silence stretched. Finally, Blake asked the only question that mattered. "Is it Derek?" Natalie froze. Not dramatically, just enough. Then she exhaled. "It's not that simple." Blake nodded slowly again. That answer told him everything, too. Natalie stood and crossed her arms. "I didn't plan this." "No one does. You're making me sound horrible." Blake looked at the packed luggage, the framed law degree, the expensive coat draped over the chair, the apartment he had paid for while working 4 jobs. Then he looked back at her. "I haven't called you horrible once." Natalie's expression hardened slightly after that, because calmness left no argument to fight against. "You'll still be okay financially," she said, "once things settle." Blake almost laughed at the phrasing, financially. Like their marriage had become a contract negotiation, like the years between them could be summarized through monthly budgets. Natalie picked up her keys. "I think this is healthier." Blake watched her carefully. For the first time in years, he realized Natalie truly believed she was moving upward in life, toward better people, better rooms, better conversations, and Blake no longer fit inside that picture. Before leaving, Natalie paused near the doorway. "I never wanted to hurt you." Blake looked down at the calluses on his hands, hands that had repaired hospital systems during blizzards, hands that had loaded trucks before sunrise, hands that had financed every semester of her future. Then he looked back at her. "But you still did," he said. Natalie didn't answer. The door closed softly behind her. Blake stood alone inside the duplex, listening to her car pull away into the Denver night. The apartment suddenly felt larger without her there. Quieter, too. He walked slowly into the bedroom afterward. Half the closet remained empty. The indentation from her suitcase wheels still marked the carpet. Blake sat on the edge of the bed in complete silence. Then his phone buzzed. Email received. Sender certified legal courier services. He opened the message. Attached were formal legal documents, petition notices, civil filings, and at the bottom of the first page beneath the attorney information, Blake saw a familiar name, Natalie Harper Simmons, Esquire, representing Derek Mercer. Blake stared at the screen while something cold settled deep inside his chest. Then he opened the attachment fully and began to read. Blake Simmons read the lawsuit 3 times before sunrise. The kitchen clock ticked softly beside him, while cold coffee sat untouched near his elbow. Outside, Denver streets disappeared beneath freezing rain. Inside the duplex, the only sound came from the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old plumbing pipes. The lawsuit accused Blake of harassment, stalking, property damage, intentional interference with business operations. Derek Mercer claimed Blake had threatened him, repeatedly appeared outside Elevate Performance Club in aggressive and unstable states and damaged property connected to the business. Attached photographs showed scratches on a black Range Rover parked outside the gym. Another page listed alleged financial losses connected to ongoing intimidation. Then Blake reached the last section, requested damages $180,000. Under attorney representation sat Natalie's full legal signature, Natalie Harper Simmons, Esquire. Blake stared at her name longer than anything else, not because the lawsuit shocked him, because she had signed it herself, not another attorney, not a senior partner, Natalie. Her first major legal filing after becoming licensed. Against her own husband. Blake leaned back slowly in the chair. His body felt strangely calm, not numb, focused, like some final uncertainty inside him had finally died. At 5:12 a.m., his phone buzzed, Natalie calling. Blake looked at the screen until it stopped ringing. A voicemail notification appeared seconds later. He never listened to it. Instead, he opened the garage door, climbed into the Ford Ranger, and drove toward his FedEx shift through freezing rain. The city looked colorless that morning. Downtown towers hidden behind low clouds. Traffic lights reflecting across wet pavement. Blake loaded freight trucks for 4 straight hours, without speaking much. One coworker asked if he was sick. "You look pale. Didn't sleep much." That part was true, but not because of anger. Blake's mind kept replaying the same question over and over. How long had Natalie and Derek planned this? The lawsuit felt too organized, too prepared, which meant conversations had already happened behind closed doors while Blake worked night shifts, financing the life they now used against him. At noon, Blake sat inside his truck outside a strip mall in Aurora and finally opened the voicemail transcript. "Blake, please don't overreact to this." Derek insisted on protecting himself legally because things were becoming uncomfortable. "Just let the attorneys handle everything calmly." Blake read the words twice. Uncomfortable, interesting choice. Because Blake remembered exactly who sat in a parking lot recording evidence while his wife kissed another man. And it had not been Derek Mercer. That afternoon, Blake searched for a lawyer. Not online reviews first, not advertisements. He searched court records, patterns, names appearing repeatedly in successful civil defense cases around Denver County Court. One name surfaced over and over. Rebecca Sloan, 52 years old, former prosecutor, known for quiet preparation and brutal cross-examinations. Office located near Civic Center Park. Blake called immediately. The receptionist almost declined after hearing the situation. Then Blake mentioned documented evidence and conflict concerns involving opposing counsel. Everything changed after that. "Ms. Sloan can see you tomorrow at 10. Blake arrived early. Rebecca Sloan's office occupied the 3rd floor of an older brick building overlooking downtown Denver traffic. No luxury lobby, no giant glass conference rooms, just quiet competence. Blake sat in the waiting room wearing work boots still dusted with insulation particles from a morning HVAC repair. At exactly 10:02 a.m., Rebecca Sloan opened her office door herself. She was shorter than Blake expected. Gray hair cut sharply above the shoulders. No wasted movement. "Mr. Simmons." Blake stood. Rebecca shook his hand once and immediately noticed the roughness in his palms. "Come in." Her office smelled faintly like paper and coffee. Blake placed a small cardboard storage box onto the conference table. Rebecca sat across from him. "Tell me what's happening." Blake spoke for nearly 20 minutes without raising his voice once. He explained Natalie's law school, the jobs, the affair, the lawsuit, the evidence. Rebecca interrupted only occasionally to clarify dates. When Blake finished, the room fell quiet. Rebecca opened the box. Inside sat organized folders, receipts, bank records, screenshots, tuition payments, printed emails. She looked up immediately. "You organized all this yourself," Blake nodded. "Started keeping things after I noticed inconsistencies." Rebecca studied him carefully now, not like a maintenance worker, like a witness. How long have you been documenting? Blake thought for a second. About 2 years, seriously. Smaller things before that. Rebecca opened another folder, dash cam still images, time-stamped. Natalie and Derek outside Elevate Performance Club. Rebecca's expression changed slightly. Does your wife know this exists? No. You ever threaten either of them? No more damage property? No. Follow Derek Mercer. I sat outside the gym one night after recognizing Natalie's car. Rebecca leaned back slowly. That's not stalking. Blake remained silent. Rebecca continued reading. Joint account statements highlighted carefully in yellow marker. Payments connected to Elevate Performance Club. Hotel charges, luxury purchases, tuition records, going back years. Rebecca finally closed the folder and folded her hands together. You understand what this looks like, right? Blake looked at her calmly. A bad marriage, Rebecca almost smiled. No, a potentially catastrophic ethics issue. Blake said nothing. Rebecca tapped Natalie's name on the lawsuit filing. Your wife is representing the man she's having an affair with in litigation against her legal spouse. Blake watched her quietly. Rebecca continued. That alone creates serious conflict concerns. But if financial misconduct or misuse of marital assets enters discovery, she exhaled softly. This could get ugly fast. Blake looked down at the table. I didn't come here to destroy her. Rebecca studied him carefully. Most clients arrive furious, loud, emotional. Blake sounded exhausted instead. What do you want? She asked. Blake answered honestly. I want the truth on record. That response seemed to matter to Rebecca. She opened the lawsuit again. They're asking for a restraining order and damages based on emotional distress and business interference. She looked up. That tells me they expected you to react emotionally. Blake thought about the parking lot, the voicemail, the accusations. Then he nodded once. Probably. Rebecca stood and walked toward the office window overlooking downtown traffic. Men like Derek Mercer usually assume men like you are predictable. Blake frowned slightly. What's that mean? They think quiet people stay quiet forever. The room went silent again. Rebecca turned back toward him. Do you still have access to all financial records? Yes. Any shared property? The duplex lease? Joint checking? Some credit cards? Rebecca nodded slowly. Good. Then she asked the question Blake had quietly feared. Do you want to save the marriage? Blake looked at the folders spread across the table. Years of overtime, years of sacrifice, years of evidence. Then he pictured Natalie signing legal documents beside Derek Mercer. Not secretly, openly, professionally. Blake answered without emotion. I think she already decided that part. Rebecca nodded once like she expected the answer. She returned to her chair and opened a legal pad. Then here's what happens next. For the next 40 minutes, Rebecca explained strategy carefully. No emotional reactions, no direct contact unless documented. Preserve all evidence, respond formally through counsel, and most importantly, do not underestimate what Natalie and Derek might do next. They filed aggressively because they think you'll panic, Rebecca said. What if I don't? Rebecca's eyes sharpened slightly. Then they have a problem. Before leaving, Blake handed Rebecca one final envelope from the bottom of the box. What's this? She asked. Copy of the joint account activity from last winter. Rebecca opened it. Inside sat detailed bank transfers totaling nearly $30,000, connected to accounts and businesses linked to Derek Mercer. Rebecca went completely still for several seconds while reading. Then she looked back at Blake slowly. This, she said carefully, changes everything. Blake frowned. How Rebecca slid the papers back into the envelope. Because now, this isn't just about an affair or a civil complaint anymore. She paused, then spoke very quietly. This starts looking like coordinated financial misconduct. Blake stared at her across the conference table while downtown Denver traffic moved silently beyond the office windows. For the first time since the lawsuit arrived, he realized something important. Natalie and Derek thought they were dragging a tired maintenance worker into court. What they actually dragged in was 7 years of records. 3 nights after hiring Rebecca Sloan Blake Simmons finally opened the metal box beneath the basement furnace. The basement smelled like dust, rust, and old concrete. A single hanging bulb swung slightly overhead while cold February wind pressed against the small ground-level windows. Blake knelt beside the furnace and pulled the box forward, slowly. Heavy steel, scratched corners. Combination lock removed years ago, after it jammed during a winter storm. Inside sat 7 years of paper. Not chaos, order. That part mattered. Every document had dates, labels, sections. Blake had never planned for the collection to become this large. At first it had only been small things that felt strange. Receipts, bank alerts, late-night expenses that didn't make sense. Then patterns started forming. And Blake Simmons trusted patterns. Because mechanical systems failed in patterns too. A weak compressor, pressure drops, temperature inconsistencies. Ignore small signs long enough and eventually entire systems collapsed. Relationships, Blake realized, were not much different. He carried the box upstairs and spread the contents across the kitchen table one folder at a time. Tuition payments, student loan balances, joint account statements, hotel receipts, screenshots, dash cam backups. Rebecca Sloan arrived 30 minutes later carrying coffee and a leather legal bag thick enough to stop bullets. She stopped walking the moment she saw the table. Jesus. Blake stood near the sink. I kept more than I realized. Rebecca removed her coat slowly while studying the documents. No dramatic reaction, just professional focus sharpening behind her eyes. How organized is all this digitally, everything scanned twice? External hard drive and cloud backup. Rebecca looked at him carefully. You work in legal before HVAC, no? Military Blake shook his head. Dad repaired industrial cooling systems. He used to say if you don't document problems, people blame the wrong thing later. Rebecca almost smiled at that. Then she sat down and began reviewing everything methodically. For nearly 2 hours, the only sounds inside the duplex came from paper turning and Rebecca occasionally asking questions. When did the hotel charges start? About 14 months ago. You highlighted these transfers yourself, yes. You still have original bank access, yes. Rebecca opened another folder. Inside sat copies of tuition invoices from the University of Denver Sturm College of Law, semester balances, book expenses, exam fees, bar prep courses, each one marked paid beside the amount. Rebecca looked up. You paid all this personally, mostly. How much total? Blake shrugged slightly. Never calculated it exactly. Rebecca grabbed a legal pad and started adding numbers manually. Tuition, books, living expenses, loan interest. Blake covered directly, parking permits, housing costs while Natalie attended school. The total kept climbing. 50,000, 90,000, 140. Rebecca stopped adding halfway through and exhaled quietly. This marriage cost you more than some people's mortgages. Blake leaned against the counter silently. He remembered every overtime shift connected to those numbers, every missed Thanksgiving, every overnight repair call during blizzards, every morning driving home while the rest of Denver woke up. Rebecca opened another folder. This one contained printed screenshots of account transfers tied to Elevate Performance Club and businesses connected to Derek Mercer. Membership charges, luxury hotel expenses, wire transfers, a payment for a ski resort weekend in Aspen. Rebecca's expression hardened. These came from the joint account. Blake nodded. She said networking events were reimbursable. Rebecca let out a dry breath through her nose. They weren't. Outside snow hit the duplex windows softly. The kitchen felt strangely still, despite everything sitting on the table between them. Rebecca finally set one stack aside carefully. "Blake, I need to ask you something directly." "Okay. Why didn't you confront her sooner?" Blake looked toward the dark hallway leading to the bedroom Natalie once shared with him. Because that was the real question, wasn't it? Why wait? Why document instead of explode? Blake answered honestly. At first I thought I was imagining things. Rebecca stayed quiet. Then I thought maybe law school was changing her temporarily. He rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw. Then after I knew for sure, I guess I kept hoping she'd stop. The honesty in that answer seemed to affect Rebecca more than anger would have. And the records, Blake looked down at the folders. I didn't want history rewritten later. That line stayed in the air for several seconds, because Blake already understood something many people learned too late. Once betrayal becomes public, the story changes, depending on who speaks first. And Natalie Harper Simmons was now an attorney trained professionally to shape narratives. Rebecca opened the dash cam folder next. Still images printed with timestamps. Natalie outside Elevate Performance Club. Natalie entering Derek's Range Rover. Natalie and Derek embracing outside a downtown restaurant. Rebecca studied them silently. Then she noticed something else. Wait. She pulled one page closer. This date here. She tapped the timestamp. That's the same night Derek claims you harassed him outside the gym. Blake nodded once. I was across the street. Rebecca's eyes sharpened immediately. You have the full footage. Yes. Showing you stayed inside the vehicle. Yes. Rebecca leaned back slowly. That's very good for us. Us. Interesting word. For the first time since this started, Blake felt like someone else could finally see the shape of what had happened. Not just the affair, the setup. Rebecca stood and paced slowly near the kitchen window. Derek Mercer expected emotional retaliation, she said. Blake remained silent. He expected angry texts, threats, maybe property damage. She glanced back toward the folders. Instead, you documented everything. Blake shrugged slightly. I fix problems for a living. Rebecca stopped pacing. No, you preserve evidence for a living. You just didn't realize it. The kitchen fell quiet again. Then Rebecca reached for Natalie's lawsuit filing and laid it beside the financial records. This is where your wife made the biggest mistake. Blake looked at her. She attached herself legally to Derek while actively benefiting from marital assets connected to him. Blake frowned slightly. And that means it means opposing counsel can argue abuse of process, breach of fiduciary obligations, conflict violations, and possible financial concealment during pending marital separation. Blake absorbed about half the legal language, but he understood the important part. Natalie had crossed lines she should have understood professionally. Rebecca looked at him carefully. You realize she knew better. Blake's jaw tightened slightly for the first time all evening. That was the part hurting most beneath everything else. Natalie knew the rules. She simply believed Blake was too ordinary to fight back properly. Rebecca continued reviewing the documents until she reached a printed email chain. Her eyebrows lifted immediately. Where did you get this shared laptop backup before she changed passwords? The email showed Natalie discussing Derek's civil claims weeks before the lawsuit was officially filed. One sentence stood out clearly. Once Blake panics, settlement becomes easier. Rebecca stared at the page for several seconds, then very carefully set it down. Well, she said quietly, that's extremely bad for them. Blake walked to the coffee pot and refilled both mugs. His hands remained steady. That surprised even him now. Rebecca accepted the coffee without taking her eyes off the email. This changes strategy completely. How we stop treating this like a defensive case. Blake sat across from her. Rebecca folded her hands together. Blake, they tried to weaponize the legal system against you. Your wife especially should have understood the ethical implications." She paused. "Now we push back formally." Blake stared at the paperwork covering the kitchen table. 7 years, reduced into stacks. Marriage quantified through receipts and timestamps. Rebecca opened her notebook again. "Tomorrow morning, I'm filing motions to challenge Natalie's representation immediately." And after that, Rebecca's expression hardened. "Then we start putting the truth into court records where it can't be hidden." Blake looked toward the basement door quietly. The metal box still sat downstairs beneath the furnace, where he had hidden it for years. At first, it had been a place to store proof for his own sanity. Now it was becoming something else entirely. Protection. Rebecca gathered several folders into organized stacks before standing. As she prepared to leave, she stopped near the front door and looked back at Blake. "One more thing. Well, when this escalates, and it will, they're going to realize you're not the man they thought you were." Blake frowned slightly. "I'm still the same guy." Rebecca gave a small, humorless smile. "No," she said. "You're the same guy they underestimated." Then she left into the Denver snow carrying copies of the evidence. Blake locked the door behind her and stood alone in the quiet duplex. On the kitchen table sat the remaining folders. Proof of every sacrifice. Proof of every lie. Proof that while Natalie Harper Simmons had been studying how to build legal cases, Blake Simmons had accidentally become one. Denver woke beneath freezing rain the morning Rebecca Sloan filed the motion to disqualify Natalie Harper Simmons from Derek Mercer's lawsuit. Blake Simmons was replacing an air circulation motor on the 4th floor of St. Vincent Medical Center when Rebecca called. The mechanical room echoed with metal vibration and spinning fans. Blake balanced his phone between shoulder and ear while tightening bolts with a socket wrench. "It's filed," Rebecca said. Blake wiped sweat from his forehead with the sleeve of his work jacket. "How bad?" Rebecca gave a short pause. "Bad enough that Natalie's probably reading it right now in complete panic." Blake said nothing. He heard papers shifting on Rebecca's end. "We challenged her representation formally based on conflict of interest, misuse of marital financial assets, and ethical concerns connected to her relationship with Mercer." The circulation motor roared alive behind Blake. He shut it down again before speaking. "And now we wait for their response." Blake looked through the mechanical room window toward the Denver skyline beyond the hospital parking structure. Gray clouds, wet roads, traffic crawling through cold morning rain. For years, Blake had spent his life repairing systems quietly, while people above him rarely noticed his existence. Now his private life sat inside official court records. Strange feeling. "You still there?" Rebecca asked. "Yeah." "You okay?" Blake tightened another bolt slowly. "I don't know yet." That answer stayed with Rebecca long after the call ended, because Blake Simmons still had not fully turned into an angry man despite everything done to him. And that restraint was becoming dangerous for the people who underestimated him. By noon, Natalie responded. Not through the court first, directly to Blake. The email arrived while he sat alone in the hospital cafeteria eating vending machine crackers and microwaved soup. Subject line, "We need to handle this carefully." Blake opened it slowly. Natalie's writing sounded colder now than it ever had in person. Professional, controlled, almost detached. "You're escalating this unnecessarily. Rebecca Sloan is deliberately framing things in ways that could seriously damage multiple careers. Derek is willing to settle matters privately if you cooperate reasonably. Please don't let anger make this uglier than it already is." Blake read the message twice, then a third time. Not once did Natalie apologize. Not once did she mention the affair directly. Not once did she acknowledge the years Blake spent building her career. Everything centered around consequences to herself and Derek. Blake forwarded the email to Rebecca immediately. 2 minutes later, Rebecca called. Do not reply. I wasn't planning to. Good. Papers shuffled sharply on her desk. Because this email helps us. How she's discussing active litigation directly with the opposing party while personally entangled in the dispute. Rebecca paused. And she's subtly pressuring you to withdraw legal claims outside formal channels. Blake leaned back in the cafeteria chair. So another mistake. Rebecca's voice hardened slightly. Blake, your wife, became very confident very quickly. That usually makes young attorneys reckless. Outside the cafeteria windows, snow mixed with rain across the parking lot. Blake watched ambulances pulling toward emergency intake. People entering the hospital with real crises, real pain. Compared to that, his marriage suddenly felt strangely small and exhausting. I don't want revenge, Blake said quietly. Rebecca answered immediately. I know. That mattered too. Because Rebecca Sloan had spent 26 years handling divorces and civil litigation. She recognized bitterness instantly. Blake wasn't bitter. He was tired, and tired people often became incredibly patient. That afternoon, Rebecca filed additional responses formally requesting financial discovery connected to joint marital assets. By evening, Derek Mercer's attorney submitted aggressive objections. Rebecca smiled when she read them. They're nervous. Blake sat in her office after another 14-hour workday, looking like he barely had enough energy left to stand. How can you tell? Because people who feel safe don't overreact this fast. Rebecca handed him printed copies of the objections. Derek's legal team argued the affair was irrelevant personal conduct. They claimed financial records constituted invasion of privacy. They insisted Blake's evidence was gathered through emotionally unstable surveillance behavior. Blake read the wording carefully. Emotionally unstable. Interesting phrase, because Blake still had not yelled once, had not threatened anyone, had not damaged anything. Meanwhile, Derek Mercer filed exaggerated emotional distress claims while carrying on an affair with another man's wife. Rebecca pointed toward one paragraph. See this? Blake nodded. They're already building a narrative that you're obsessive. Am I? Rebecca looked directly at him. No. Obsessive people lose control. She tapped the evidence folders beside her desk. You documented facts. The distinction mattered legally, and Rebecca intended to exploit it fully. 3 days later, Natalie made another mistake, a larger one. It happened during a late-night email exchange between attorneys. Rebecca nearly laughed when she saw it. Natalie accidentally copied Blake on an internal communication intended only for Derek and co-counsel. The message appeared brief but devastating. If Blake keeps pushing discovery, we need to pressure settlement before financial tracing expands further. Rebecca called Blake immediately after midnight. Tell me you didn't respond. I didn't. Excellent. Blake sat inside the Ford Ranger, outside St. Vincent Medical Center, while snow accumulated across the hood. What does it mean? Rebecca's tone sharpened. It means your wife knows the financial records are dangerous. Blake stared through the windshield. For the first time, he started understanding the full shape of what Natalie and Derek had attempted. Not just an affair, not just betrayal. They genuinely believed Blake would panic emotionally, sign whatever settlement got placed in front of him, and disappear quietly. That realization changed something inside him, not rage, clarity. The following week, Rebecca prepared Blake for the upcoming hearing. Her office conference room filled with legal pads, printed exhibits, and timelines pinned carefully across the table. Court isn't about emotion, she told him. It's about credibility. Blake nodded once. Rebecca pointed toward the timeline. Derek claims you harassed him over several months, but during multiple alleged incidents, you were clocked into hospital shifts. Blake studied the highlighted records. Hospital badge logs, timestamps, maintenance dispatch reports. Every boring detail of his exhausting life had quietly become evidence. Rebecca continued. You know what's ironic? What the reason your documentation is so strong is because you spent years living predictably. Blake frowned slightly. Rebecca gestured toward the paperwork. You worked, paid bills, went home, repeated the same schedule constantly? She leaned back. Men hiding dangerous behavior usually leave messy patterns. You didn't. The room went quiet. Then Rebecca opened Natalie's professional profile page from Barrett & Klein LLP. Fresh headshot, bright smile. Practice areas civil litigation and professional advocacy. Rebecca looked at Blake carefully. She built this image fast. Blake studied the screen. Natalie looked polished, confident. Nothing like the exhausted cafe waitress from Colorado Springs years earlier. She always wanted more, Blake said quietly. There's nothing wrong with ambition. No. Blake looked away from the screen. But there's something wrong with forgetting who carried you there. Rebecca didn't answer immediately, because there wasn't much to add after that. 2 nights before the hearing, Blake returned home after a double shift and found another email waiting. This one, shorter, more personal. From Natalie. You need to stop this before it destroys everything. Blake stared at the sentence for a long time. Destroys everything. As if he were the one who filed false claims, as if he were the one who cheated, as if he were the one weaponizing the legal system against a spouse. Blake typed only 4 words, then stopped, deleted them, closed the laptop. That restraint mattered too. Because every hour Natalie grew more emotional and reactive, Blake became calmer. And calm men with evidence are difficult to manipulate. The night before the hearing, Blake stood alone in the garage organizing documents one final time. The metal toolbox remained open beside him, folders stacked carefully, tuition records, dash cam stills, bank transfers, emails. Years of sacrifice transformed into legal exhibits. Outside, Denver wind rattled the garage door softly. Blake looked down at his rough hands for a long moment. These hands had built Natalie's future. Tomorrow they would carry the proof that she tried using that future against him. Then Blake placed the final folder into Rebecca Sloan's trial box and quietly closed the lid. The hearing took place on a Thursday morning inside Denver County Courtroom, 4B. Snow covered the courthouse steps in gray slush while attorneys hurried through metal detectors, carrying coffee cups and leather briefcases. Blake Simmons arrived 23 minutes early. That was normal for him. People who spent years working 4 jobs learned to arrive early everywhere because being late could collapse entire schedules. He wore the charcoal suit borrowed from his older brother, Ryan. The sleeves sat slightly short at the wrists. The shoes pinched his feet, but the suit was clean, pressed carefully. Blake stood near the courtroom doors holding Rebecca Sloan's document case while watching lawyers move through the hallway with practiced confidence. Most of them never looked at him twice. Maintenance men became invisible in places like this. Rebecca arrived carrying 2 legal binders and a travel mug. She glanced at Blake once. You sleep at all? Couple hours. Enough. Rebecca never wasted words. That was one reason Blake trusted her. Inside courtroom 4, B fluorescent lights reflected across polished wooden benches. The room smelled faintly like paper dust and burnt coffee from somewhere down the hallway. Judge Harold Bennett presided from an elevated bench beneath the Colorado State Seal. 63 years old, former military prosecutor, known for little patience and strong attention to courtroom procedure. Rebecca considered that a good sign. Natalie Harper Simmons entered 5 minutes later beside Derek Mercer. Blake looked up only briefly when they walked in, but even that brief glance told him everything. Natalie wore a tailored black suit and carried herself with the polished confidence of someone still believing she controlled the room. Derek looked expensive as always. Navy overcoat, perfect haircut, gold watch flashing beneath courtroom lights. They looked like successful people, and Blake understood something uncomfortable in that moment. If evidence did not exist, people would believe them over him instantly, because appearances mattered. Rebecca leaned toward Blake slightly. "Remember," she whispered, "let them underestimate you." Blake nodded once. Natalie noticed him then. For half a second, something uncertain crossed her face. Not guilt, concern. Because Blake didn't look angry. He looked prepared. That difference unsettled her more than shouting would have. The hearing began promptly at 9 a.m. Natalie stood first, confident voice, controlled pace, professional posture. Blake listened quietly while she described Derek Mercer as a respected Denver business owner suffering from ongoing harassment and intimidation by an emotionally unstable, estranged spouse. Every sentence sounded polished, practiced. Blake noticed Natalie barely looked at him directly while speaking. Instead, she addressed the judge constantly. "Mr. Simmons has repeatedly appeared outside my client's business. Mr. Simmons has exhibited obsessive surveillance behavior. Mr. Mercer fears escalation." Derek sat beside her, wearing carefully measured concern. At one point, Natalie described Blake as struggling emotionally with abandonment and instability following marital separation. That line almost made Blake laugh. Not because it was funny, because he had spent the previous night replacing emergency ventilation systems inside a hospital while they prepared narratives about emotional instability. Rebecca remained still beside him, taking occasional notes. Judge Bennett finally looked toward her. Ms. Sloan Rebecca stood slowly. No theatrics, no raised voice. "Your Honor, before addressing substantive allegations, the defense requests immediate consideration of serious conflict and ethics concerns regarding opposing counsel." Natalie's posture stiffened instantly. Rebecca continued calmly. "Counsel for plaintiff is simultaneously the legal spouse of the defendant and the admitted intimate partner of the plaintiff." A murmur moved quietly through the courtroom. Derek shifted slightly in his chair. Natalie recovered quickly. "My personal life is irrelevant to the underlying claims." Rebecca nodded once, ordinarily perhaps. She opened a binder carefully. "However, counsel's personal and financial entanglements directly intersect with disputed marital assets, litigation motives, and credibility issues central to this matter." Judge Bennett removed his glasses slowly. That was the first moment Blake sensed the atmosphere changing. Natalie sensed it too. Rebecca approached the evidence table. "For clarity, Your Honor, the defense has documented substantial financial transfers from shared marital accounts benefiting plaintiff Mercer during the period in which counsel Harper Simmons pursued litigation strategy against her own spouse." Natalie stood immediately. Objection, irrelevant, and inflammatory. Rebecca didn't even glance toward her. It becomes highly relevant when litigation itself appears connected to coordinated financial concealment and pressure tactics. Judge Bennett raised one hand. "Sit down, Ms. Harper Simmons. I'll decide relevance." Natalie sat, but barely. Blake watched a faint redness spread across her neck for the first time since entering the courtroom. Rebecca continued. "The defense further submits that plaintiff's allegations rely heavily on claims of stalking and threatening conduct." She opened another folder. "However, employment records, time-stamped surveillance footage, and location documentation directly contradict multiple allegations." Derek leaned toward Natalie and whispered something sharply. Blake noticed Natalie's jaw tighten. Rebecca handed documents to the clerk. Hospital time card records, HVAC dispatch logs, badge access reports. Every dull detail from Blake's exhausting work life suddenly carried legal weight. Judge Bennett reviewed several pages quietly, then looked toward Natalie. "Counsel, your filings state the defendant damaged property on January 17th at approximately 11:40 p.m. "Yes, Your Honor?" Rebecca spoke immediately. "At 11:40 p.m., Mr. Simmons was clocked into emergency maintenance repair at St. Vincent Medical Center. She slid another document forward. Verified by hospital security logs and supervisory sign-off. Natalie opened her mouth, closed it again. Derek shifted in his seat harder this time. Rebecca pressed forward smoothly. Additionally, plaintiff alleges ongoing intimidation outside Elevate Performance Club. She paused. Defense does not dispute that Mr. Simmons observed his spouse and plaintiff together outside the business on one occasion. Natalie's face changed instantly. There it was, the first genuine crack. Rebecca continued calmly. However, the complete footage demonstrates Mr. Simmons remained inside his vehicle across the street for the duration of the recording. Judge Bennett leaned forward slightly. Recording, Rebecca nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Natalie stood again. Objection. This is becoming an inappropriate exploration of private marital conduct. Judge Bennett looked directly at her. Counsel, are you denying a personal relationship with plaintiff Mercer? Silence. Brief. Dangerous, Natalie answered carefully. No, Your Honor. That single admission shifted the room, not dramatically, quietly, like pressure changing before a storm. Rebecca stepped toward the evidence monitor. Your Honor, the defense believes plaintiff's allegations cannot be evaluated accurately without examining context, motive, and timeline inconsistencies. Derek's attorney, an older litigator, Rebecca recognized immediately, finally stood. We strongly object to turning this proceeding into character assassination. Rebecca looked at him evenly. No one forced your client to file a questionable lawsuit through the husband's own spouse. The older attorney sat back down slowly, because there was no clean response to that. Judge Bennett folded his hands together. I want to see the footage. Natalie turned toward Derek immediately. Panic flashed across her face for less than a second, but Blake saw it. Because for the first time since this began, Natalie understood something important. This was no longer a private betrayal hidden inside apartments and hotel rooms. This was evidence. Official. Permanent. Rebecca connected her laptop to the courtroom monitor calmly. Blake sat perfectly still beside the defense table while snow drifted past courthouse windows outside. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly. The screen flickered alive. Timestamp visible in the corner. 1:13 a.m. Across the street from Elevate Performance Club, Blake's Ford Ranger remained parked silently beneath falling snow. Then the gym door opened. Natalie appeared first, Derek Mercer behind her. The courtroom stayed completely silent as the footage continued. Derek touched Natalie's face gently, then kissed her. Long enough, clear enough, impossible to explain away. Blake never looked toward Natalie during the video. He kept his eyes on the defense table while Rebecca allowed the footage to play fully without interruption. When the screen finally went black again, Judge Bennett removed his glasses slowly. Then he looked directly at Natalie Harper Simmons. Counsel, he said carefully, do you fully understand the ethical implications of what I'm looking at here? Natalie opened her mouth to answer, but Rebecca Sloan reached for another folder before she could speak, and Blake realized the hearing was only beginning. The courtroom stayed silent after the video ended. Not dramatic silence, heavy silence, the kind that settles over a room when everyone realizes the story they were handed no longer works. Judge Harold Bennett leaned back slowly in his chair while the frozen image from Blake Simmons' dash cam remained paused on the courtroom monitor. Timestamp glowing in the corner, 1:13 a.m. Natalie Harper Simmons sat perfectly still at the plaintiff's table beside Derek Mercer. But Blake noticed the small things now, the tightness around her mouth, the way her fingers pressed too hard against her legal pad, the slight rise and fall of her breathing. For the first time since entering the courthouse, Natalie looked young again. Not powerful, not polished, just nervous. Judge Bennett finally spoke. Counsel, he said calmly, I asked whether you understood the ethical implications here. Natalie cleared her throat. Yes, Your Honor. Do you... A longer pause this time. Natalie chose her words carefully. My personal relationship with Mr. Mercer does not invalidate legitimate concerns about Mr. Simmons's behavior. Rebecca Sloan stood immediately. Then perhaps we should discuss the timeline attached to those concerns. Rebecca approached the evidence table and lifted another folder. Blake recognized the blue tabs instantly. Bank records, joint account statements. Weeks earlier, he had organized them himself while sitting alone at the kitchen table Natalie used to study at. Rebecca handed copies toward the clerk and opposing counsel. Defense Exhibit 14 through 22, she said calmly. Financial records tied directly to shared marital accounts. Derek's attorney stood quickly. Objection. Financial matters between spouses are irrelevant to the alleged harassment claims. Rebecca turned toward him. They become relevant when plaintiff's relationship with opposing counsel appears financially supported through marital funds belonging partly to the defendant. Judge Bennett held out one hand. Overruled for now. Proceed. Rebecca nodded once. Then she placed one enlarged document onto the monitor. A transfer from Blake and Natalie's joint checking account. $4,800. 100. Destination. Elevate Performance Club Executive Services. Date 3 days before Derek filed the lawsuit. Rebecca spoke quietly. Mr. Simmons worked 4 jobs during this period, including overnight hospital maintenance shifts, averaging 72 hours weekly. Blake hated hearing his life summarized like statistics, but he understood why it mattered. Rebecca displayed another record: luxury hotel charge, Aspen Resort reservation. 2 guests, paid using the same joint account Blake used for mortgage payments and utilities. Natalie stood again. Your Honor, this is becoming intentionally prejudicial. Judge Bennett looked toward her calmly. Counsel, were these shared marital funds? Natalie hesitated. Yes, but that's enough. The judge looked back toward Rebecca. Continue. Derek Mercer shifted uncomfortably in his chair for the first time all morning. Blake noticed sweat beginning near Derek's collar despite the cold courtroom. Interesting. Men like Derek usually lived inside control. Now control was slipping. Rebecca pressed another button on the courtroom monitor. A spreadsheet appeared. Blake's spreadsheet. Every tuition payment he made over 7 years, semester balances, housing costs, exam prep, book purchases, parking permits, even gas expenses tied to Natalie's commute during law school. At the bottom sat the total, $214,387.62. The number hung silently inside the courtroom. Natalie stared at the screen without blinking. Blake looked down at his rough hands instead, because every dollar on that screen carried physical memory, frozen mornings, overtime shifts, missed sleep, years disappearing inside work uniforms and boiler rooms. Rebecca spoke carefully. During the exact period Mr. Simmons financed defendant Harper Simmons's legal education and living expenses, marital assets were simultaneously redirected toward plaintiff Mercer. Derek's attorney objected again. Speculation, Rebecca immediately responded. Then let's remove speculation. She opened another folder, email printouts. Blake felt the atmosphere change again the moment Rebecca placed them on the evidence table. Natalie noticed too. Rebecca lifted one sheet carefully. This email was recovered from synchronized marital cloud backups prior to password restriction changes. Natalie's face lost color immediately. Blake saw it happen in real time. Not panic yet. Recognition. Because Natalie suddenly understood exactly which email Rebecca held. Rebecca read aloud calmly. If Blake keeps pushing discovery, we need to pressure settlement before financial tracing expands further. The courtroom remained perfectly still. Judge Bennett looked directly at Natalie. Did you write this? Natalie swallowed once. Yes, Your Honor, but... And who exactly is we? Natalie glanced toward Derek instinctively. That single movement answered the question before words ever could. Rebecca stepped forward. Your Honor, the defense position is becoming increasingly clear. She paused briefly. Plaintiff Mercer and counsel Harper Simmons anticipated emotional reaction from Mr. Simmons following disclosure of their relationship. Instead of receiving emotional retaliation, they received silence. Rebecca's voice stayed calm, controlled, deadly, so they constructed legal pressure. Blake watched several people in the courtroom exchange quiet looks, court clerks, observers. Even Derek's attorney now seemed deeply uncomfortable. Because evidence creates momentum, and momentum had started turning. Rebecca continued, the problem for plaintiff is that Mr. Simmons documented his life carefully for years. She gestured toward the records, his work schedules, financial contributions, communications, timelines. She paused again. Facts became difficult to manipulate. Judge Bennett removed his glasses once more. Ms. Harper Simmons. Natalie straightened slowly. Yes, Your Honor. Why exactly did you believe representing Mr. Mercer personally in this matter was appropriate? Natalie opened her mouth carefully. At the time, I believed I could remain objective. Judge Bennett stared at her for several seconds. And do you still believe that Natalie didn't answer immediately? That delay mattered more than words. Derek finally leaned toward his attorney and whispered sharply. The older attorney nodded once before standing. Your Honor, plaintiff requests brief recess to confer. Judge Bennett checked the courtroom clock. 10 minutes. The gavel struck softly. Instantly, the room exploded into quiet movement. Attorneys gathered papers. People whispered. Natalie stood quickly and disappeared through side doors with Derek and counsel. Blake remained seated. Rebecca closed folders calmly beside him. You okay? She asked. Blake nodded once. Didn't expect the email to hit that hard. Rebecca gave a humorless smile because it showed intent. Blake looked toward the empty plaintiff table. They really thought I'd panic. Yes. Rebecca studied him carefully. And honestly, most people would have. Blake leaned back slowly in the chair. Courtroom lights buzzed overhead. Outside, snow drifted across downtown Denver streets. For years, Blake Simmons had been invisible in rooms exactly like this. Maintenance worker. Overworked husband. Forgettable. Now every boring detail of his life was dismantling the story Derek and Natalie built against him. Rebecca lowered her voice slightly. There's something else happening here. What Judge Bennett hates misuse of process. She organized another stack of exhibits, especially when attorneys weaponize personal relationships inside litigation. Blake absorbed that quietly. Then he asked the question sitting beneath everything else. Is her career finished? Rebecca paused before answering. No. Then another pause. But it's damaged now, probably permanently. Blake looked down at the table again. Strangely, the answer didn't satisfy him, didn't make him happy. Mostly it made him tired, because despite everything, part of him still remembered Natalie studying case law beneath blankets beside a broken heater years earlier. That memory refused to die completely. The courtroom doors opened again. Natalie returned first. But something about her had changed during those 10 minutes. The confidence was gone. Her shoulders sat tighter now, eyes more careful. Derek looked worse, angry, sweating slightly. Rebecca noticed immediately. They're scared now, she whispered. Judge Bennett returned moments later. Everyone stood, then sat. The judge reviewed several notes silently before speaking. Based on materials presented thus far, this court has serious concerns regarding conflict issues and credibility problems surrounding plaintiff representation. Natalie lowered her eyes briefly. Judge Bennett continued. Additionally, several factual allegations require further evidentiary review before this court will entertain any restraining request. Derek's attorney shifted uncomfortably. Rebecca stayed motionless. Then Judge Bennett looked directly toward Natalie Harper Simmons one final time. I strongly advise counsel to consider independent ethics representation immediately. The warning landed like concrete inside the room, not because the judge raised his voice, because he didn't need to. Blake watched Natalie carefully after that. For the first time since all of this began, she looked at him directly. Not with anger, not superiority, fear. And Blake realized something important in that moment. Natalie had spent years believing she escaped the life Blake came from. But now the same man she underestimated was quietly holding her entire future together in labeled folders and time-stamped files. 3 days after the hearing, Natalie Harper Simmons lost control of Derek Mercer's lawsuit. Officially, the court called it temporary removal pending ethical review. Unofficially, everyone inside Denver's litigation circle understood what had happened. A first-year attorney had walked into court representing her married lover against her own husband. Then evidence surfaced. Now people were talking. Blake Simmons learned the update while replacing air filters in the pediatric wing at St. Vincent Medical Center. Rebecca Sloan called around 6:40 a.m. "It's done," she said. Blake balanced the phone between his shoulder and ear while tightening vent screws. "What's done?" Judge Bennett signed the order. "Natalie's removed from active representation." Blake stopped working for a second. Children's cartoon voices echoed faintly from nearby hospital rooms. "She can't work the case anymore. Not directly." Derek hired outside counsel this morning. Blake looked through the hospital window toward the pale Denver sunrise. The city looked washed out after another snowstorm, and Rebecca paused. "That part's getting worse." Later that afternoon, Rebecca forwarded Blake an official copy of the ethics complaint she had submitted to the Colorado Office of Attorney Regulation Counsel. 43 pages, attachments included, timeline summaries, conflict concerns, financial records, questionable communications. Blake sat alone in the hospital cafeteria reading parts of it slowly while exhausted nurses rotated around him. He felt strange seeing his marriage translated into legal language, years of sacrifice compressed into numbered exhibits. Every sleepless night now attached to formal accusations. Rebecca joined him later that evening at a diner near Capitol Hill because she wanted to discuss strategy privately. The diner smelled like burnt bacon and coffee refills. Blake ordered meatloaf because it was cheap and filling. Rebecca ordered tea. "You know what happens next?" she asked. Blake shook his head. "Discovery expands. Derek's legal team starts protecting themselves instead of attacking you." Blake cut into the meatloaf quietly, and Rebecca stirred her tea slowly. "She's trying to stop the bleeding." That phrase stayed with Blake because it sounded medical, like Natalie's career had become an injury instead of a success story. Outside the diner windows, headlights reflected across wet Denver streets. Blake finally asked the question directly. "Did I go too far?" Rebecca looked at him carefully before answering. "No." Then she leaned forward slightly. "She went too far when she signed the lawsuit." Blake looked down at his plate again. The problem was he still didn't enjoy any of this. People expected betrayed husbands to want destruction, to want revenge. But Blake mostly wanted sleep. Real sleep. The kind he hadn't had in years. For the first time in a long time, Blake began sleeping longer after the hearing. Not well, but longer. One night he slept nearly 6 straight hours on the couch after finishing a double shift. When he woke up around dawn, sunlight spilled across the quiet duplex through half-open blinds. No law textbooks on the table. No late-night arguments, no tension hanging in the rooms, just silence. He stood in the kitchen, making coffee when someone knocked on the front door. Blake already knew who it was before opening it. Natalie. She stood on the porch wearing a dark wool coat and no makeup. That detail surprised him first. Natalie usually looked carefully assembled now, professional, sharp. Today she looked tired, actually tired. "You busy?" she asked quietly. Blake stepped aside without answering. Natalie entered, slowly looking around the duplex like she hadn't seen it properly in years. The old couch, the cracked kitchen tile, the furnace vent. Blake never got around to repainting. The place suddenly looked very small beside the downtown apartments and rooftop bars she preferred now. Blake walked into the kitchen and placed his phone directly on the table. Then he opened the voice recording app. Natalie noticed immediately. "You're recording this?" "Yes." The answer came calm and flat. Natalie stared at him for a second, then nodded once. "Okay." Blake pressed record openly and sat across from her at the kitchen table. That mattered too. No hidden devices, no tricks, just transparency. Natalie folded her hands together tightly. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The refrigerator hummed softly behind them. Finally, Natalie broke first. "You filed an ethics complaint." Blake looked at her steadily. "Rebecca did." "But you approved it." "Yes." Natalie exhaled sharply through her nose. "You have any idea what this could do to me?" Blake almost answered immediately, then stopped himself, because the question sounded unbelievable coming from her. Years earlier, Blake had sold his father's watch to pay for Natalie's bar prep course. Now she sat across from him asking if he understood consequences. "I think I do," he said quietly. Natalie rubbed one hand against her forehead. "You're making this impossible to fix." Blake watched her carefully. Interesting wording again. Not impossible to survive, impossible to fix. Because Natalie still viewed the situation like damage control, a professional crisis, not betrayal. "You sued me," Blake said. Natalie's eyes flashed briefly. "That wasn't my decision alone, but you signed it." Silence. Natalie looked away toward the kitchen window. Outside, snow melted slowly from parked cars lining the street. "You don't understand, Derek," she said finally. Blake nearly laughed at that. "No," he answered softly. "I understand him perfectly now." Natalie's jaw tightened. "He thought you were becoming unstable." Blake looked at her for several seconds before speaking again. "Did you?" Natalie didn't answer immediately. That hesitation hurt more than insults would have, because Blake realized part of her actually had believed it, not because of his behavior, because people like Derek Mercer convinced people like Natalie that exhausted working-class men were dangerous by default, too emotional, too rough, too replaceable. Natalie finally spoke again. "You started documenting everything. I started documenting after you started lying." Natalie opened her mouth, closed it again. The truth left little room to maneuver. Blake reached for his coffee mug slowly. Steam drifted upward between them. For a moment, neither looked like enemies, just two exhausted people sitting in the ruins of something they once believed would last. Then Natalie said the thing that finally revealed why she came. "You can still stop this." Blake looked up. The complaint. There it was. Not apology, not remorse. Career protection. Natalie leaned forward now. "If you tell Rebecca to withdraw cooperation, this doesn't have to destroy everything." Blake stared at her quietly. Years earlier, he would have done almost anything to protect Natalie. Worked harder, slept less, sold more possessions. Now she wanted protection from consequences instead. "You know what's strange?" Blake asked softly. Natalie frowned slightly. "You never sounded this worried when I was working 4 jobs." Natalie's face tightened immediately. "That's not fair." Blake nodded once. "No, probably not." The kitchen went silent again. Then Natalie's voice lowered. "I made mistakes." Blake looked at her steadily. "Mistakes are forgetting birthdays." He paused. "You built a legal case against your husband with the guy you were sleeping with." Natalie flinched slightly at the bluntness. Blake rarely spoke that directly. Maybe that scared her more than shouting would have. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered. Blake believed She meant that, not because she regretted the affair, because she never imagined losing control of the narrative. That was different. Blake leaned back in the chair slowly. You know the worst part. Natalie looked at him carefully. I would have given you a clean divorce. That hit harder than anger. Because it was true. If Natalie had simply left honestly, Blake probably would have walked away quietly. But she didn't just leave. She tried to bury him legally afterward. Natalie looked down at the table. For the first time since arriving, she seemed smaller somehow, less polished, less certain. Then her voice cracked slightly. You can still save my career. Blake stared at her across the kitchen table while the recorder continued capturing every word. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, he finally understood something clearly. Natalie wasn't afraid of losing him anymore. She was afraid of becoming him, ordinary, powerless, forced to start over from nothing. Blake Simmons did not answer Natalie immediately after she asked him to save her career. The kitchen stayed quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the old wall clock above the stove. Natalie sat across from him, with both hands wrapped tightly around a paper coffee cup she hadn't touched. The recorder on the table continued blinking red between them, documenting everything, just like Blake always did now. Outside the duplex windows, Denver morning traffic moved slowly through melting snow. Inside, 7 years of marriage sat like debris between two people who no longer recognized each other completely. Blake leaned back in his chair. You know what I kept thinking about after the hearing? Natalie looked up carefully. What? The first winter? Your law school heater broke? Natalie blinked, once caught off guard. Blake stared past her for a moment, remembering. The duplex pipes froze. We had that little space heater in the bedroom. He rubbed one thumb slowly against the side of his coffee mug. You stayed up reading tort law while I crawled under the building fixing water lines. Natalie lowered her eyes slightly. Blake continued quietly. You remember what you said that night she didn't answer. You said once you became a lawyer, we'd never struggle like that again. The silence after that sentence felt long, not hostile, heavy, because both of them knew Blake had kept his side of that promise. Natalie's voice came softer now. I was grateful back then. Blake looked at her directly. Back then, Natalie flinched slightly. The problem with calm people was that when they finally spoke plainly, every word landed harder. Blake stood and walked toward the kitchen counter slowly. His knees hurt from another overnight shift. Years of labor had settled permanently into his joints now. He opened a drawer and removed a thick folder. Natalie's expression changed immediately when she recognized it. The financial records. Blake placed the folder on the table carefully. Then he sat back down and opened it, page after page. Tuition statements, housing payments, credit card balances, exam prep invoices. Every sacrifice with dates attached. Natalie stared at the paperwork while Blake flipped through sections methodically. First semester tuition, he said quietly. $28,412. Another page. Bar prep course. $2,100. Another. Apartment rent near campus while I stayed here working nights. Natalie's breathing grew tighter. Blake wasn't yelling. That somehow made everything worse. I sold my dad's watch for this one, Blake said, sliding another invoice forward. Natalie closed her eyes briefly. Blake, no. You wanted to talk. He turned another page. Truck transmission replacement delayed 11 months because your school fees were due. He looked at her evenly. Remember that Natalie nodded faintly. Blake continued. 3 Christmases with no vacation. Another page. 72-hour work weeks. Another. FedEx loading dock from 6 to 10 in the morning before hospital shifts. Natalie finally whispered, Stop. Blake looked at her calmly. I'm not saying this to hurt you. Then why? Because you keep talking like this started with the complaint. The words settled hard between them. Because Natalie had spent weeks treating consequences as the beginning of the story. Not the affair, not the lies, not the lawsuit. The consequences. Blake folded his hands slowly on top of the folder. You know what I never understood. Natalie wiped beneath one eye quickly before answering. What? How you became embarrassed of me while living off my exhaustion? That one hit. Blake saw it immediately in her face, not because it was cruel, because it was accurate. Natalie looked toward the kitchen window again. I wasn't embarrassed of you. Blake waited. Natalie exhaled shakily. She struggled for the words. Everything changed when I entered that world. The lawyer world, yes. Blake nodded slowly. People started treating you differently? Natalie looked back at him. You don't understand what it's like in those rooms? No, Blake admitted. Probably not. And there it was again. That strange thing Blake did during conflict. He told the truth even when it weakened his position emotionally. Natalie noticed it too. Maybe she always had. You'd walk into networking events wearing work boots, she said quietly. People looked at us differently. Blake almost smiled. There it is. Natalie frowned. What? The real answer. She looked away immediately because she heard it too. Not money. Not opportunity. Shame? Blake leaned forward slightly. You know the crazy part, I never cared that those people looked down on me. His voice stayed level. I cared that eventually you started joining them. Natalie covered part of her face with one hand. For several seconds she said nothing at all. Then finally, I felt trapped. Blake studied her quietly. In what? In the life we had. That sentence should have made him angry. Instead, it mostly made him tired, because Blake finally understood something clearly. Natalie didn't just fall in love with Derek Mercer, she fell in love with the version of herself she thought existed around men like him. Polished, ambitious, important. Derek represented escape from struggle. Meanwhile, Blake represented the years she wanted to outgrow, the duplex, the second jobs, the smell of machine oil, the exhaustion. Natalie's voice cracked slightly. I didn't mean for this to happen. Blake looked down at the folder again, then at the recorder blinking softly on the table. You filed a restraining order against me. Natalie swallowed. Derek thought number Blake interrupted gently but firmly. You signed it. That distinction mattered deeply to him, because Natalie kept trying to distribute blame across Derek's stress law firm's pressure circumstances. But signatures belonged to individuals. That was something lawyers understood better than anyone. Blake closed the folder slowly. You know what Rebecca asked me? Natalie looked up carefully. She asked if I wanted revenge. And Blake thought about it honestly. I wanted the truth somewhere. Nobody could erase it. Natalie stared at him silently. Then finally she whispered, You already won. Blake shook his head once. This isn't winning. And he meant it. Winning implied satisfaction. There was nothing satisfying about sitting across from someone you once loved while explaining how they destroyed themselves. Natalie rubbed her hands together nervously. What happens now? Blake answered honestly. I don't know. That uncertainty frightened Natalie more than anger would have, because angry people could be negotiated with. Calm people simply continued forward. She leaned closer across the table. If the ethics board suspends me, her voice trembled now, I could lose everything before my career even starts. Blake looked at her for a long moment. Then he asked quietly, What did you think would happen to me? Natalie froze. Blake continued, You and Derek tried building a legal case that painted me unstable. His eyes stayed steady on hers. You think that wouldn't destroy my life? Natalie opened her mouth slowly. Nothing came out, because there was no answer to that. Blake leaned back again. For years he had watched Natalie become sharper with language, more skilled, more persuasive. Now sitting in the kitchen they once shared, she had no argument left, only consequences. The clock ticked softly overhead. Finally Blake spoke one last time. I already financed your future once. Natalie's eyes filled immediately because she already knew what was coming next. Blake's voice stayed calm. I'm not financing your lies, too. Natalie looked down at the table. For the first time since arriving, she truly seemed defeated. Not legally, personally. Like she had finally realized Blake Simmons was no longer carrying the weight of her decisions for her. After several minutes, she stood slowly from the table. Blake remained seated. Natalie picked up her coat with trembling hands. At the doorway, she stopped without turning around. I did love you. Blake looked toward the hallway leading to the bedroom they once shared. Maybe she did, at some point, before ambition mixed with shame and turned into something colder. Yeah, he said quietly. I think you did. Natalie closed her eyes briefly after hearing that. Then she walked out into the cold Denver morning without another word. Blake stayed at the kitchen table long after the front door shut. The recorder still blinked red softly beside the unopened folder of financial records. Proof of every year, every sacrifice, every choice. And for the first time in a very long time, Blake Simmons realized he no longer felt afraid of losing Natalie Harper. Because somewhere during all those exhausting years, he had already lost her long before Derek Mercer ever appeared. The lawsuit against Blake Simmons began collapsing 2 weeks later. Not dramatically, not all at once. It came apart the same way old mechanical systems failed inside St. Vincent Medical Center, slowly at first, then all at once after enough pressure built behind hidden cracks. Blake was replacing a faulty rooftop ventilation unit during a freezing Thursday afternoon when Rebecca Sloan called. Wind hammered across the hospital roof hard enough to sting exposed skin. Blake crouched beside an open service panel while holding the phone against one ear. Derek's attorney wants to amend the complaint, Rebecca said. Blake tightened a bolt carefully. What does that mean? It means they're retreating. Blake looked out across the Denver skyline beneath gray clouds. How much? Rebecca gave a dry laugh. Enough to tell me they're scared. By the following Monday, several allegations had quietly disappeared from Derek Mercer's lawsuit. The property damage claims weakened first, then parts of the harassment accusations, then references to Blake being physically threatening. Rebecca spread the revised filings across her conference table, while Blake sat across from her in work clothes after another overnight shift. They're stripping out anything they can't defend under discovery, she explained. Blake rubbed tired eyes with rough fingers. So they know they're losing. Rebecca nodded once. They know lying becomes expensive once evidence enters the room. Blake stared at the paperwork silently. For months, Derek Mercer had sounded untouchable, confident, connected. Now attorneys were quietly cutting away parts of his story like surgeons removing infected tissue. Rebecca slid another folder toward Blake. This is bigger. Inside sat hospital security records from the night Derek claimed Blake vandalized property near Elevate Performance Club, time-stamped footage, employee badge logs, maintenance dispatch records. The timeline placed Blake inside St. Vincent Medical Center during nearly the entire alleged incident window. Rebecca tapped the page. This alone destroys a major section of their complaint. Blake leaned back slowly. So why file it in the first place? Rebecca looked at him evenly. Because they expected fear to work faster than facts. That answer stayed with Blake. Fear. That was the real strategy from the beginning. Not truth, pressure, embarrassment, legal intimidation. Derek Mercer assumed a tired HVAC worker would fold under official paperwork and courtroom threats. Instead, Blake responded with documentation. And documentation kept spreading. 3 days later, Rebecca received something unexpected. A call from a former employee of Elevate Performance Club, name Marcus Delaney, former operations manager, worked under Derek Mercer for almost 3 years, requested confidentiality before speaking. Rebecca arranged the meeting immediately. Blake attended quietly, sitting near the back of Rebecca's office conference room while Marcus spoke nervously across the table. Marcus looked exhausted, mid-30s, thin beard, constantly rubbing sweaty palms against his jeans. "I'm not trying to get involved in drama," Marcus said quickly. "But once I heard about the lawsuit, some things didn't sit right anymore." Rebecca nodded calmly. "Take your time." Marcus glanced toward Blake briefly before continuing. "Derek stages stuff sometimes." Blake looked up slowly. "What kind of stuff?" Marcus swallowed hard. "Insurance claims, damage reports, membership disputes." He hesitated again. "Anything that helps business leverage?" Rebecca's eyes sharpened immediately. "You're saying Derek fabricated incidents?" Marcus nodded reluctantly. "There was a black Range Rover incident last winter." He looked directly at Blake now. "The scratches already existed before Derek blamed you." The room went silent. Blake felt something cold settle deeper inside his chest. Not shock, confirmation. Marcus continued nervously. "I remember because Derek was furious about repair costs. Then after the hearing, stuff started happening between you and Natalie." He shrugged weakly. Suddenly the vehicle became evidence. Rebecca exchanged one long look with Blake. Then she spoke carefully. "Would you testify to this?" Marcus looked terrified. "If subpoenaed, yes." That changed everything. After Marcus left, Rebecca closed the conference room door slowly. "Criminal exposure," she said quietly. Blake frowned. For Derek, definitely." She paused. "Possibly Natalie too, depending on what she knew." Blake walked toward the office window overlooking downtown Denver traffic. People moved below in winter coats, carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Normal lives continuing. Meanwhile, his marriage had somehow turned into fraud investigations and ethics complaints. "I never wanted this," he said quietly. Rebecca studied him for several seconds. "I know." That was the strange thing. The deeper the case went, the more obvious Blake's restraint became. He never chased escalation. Evidence did that by itself. 2 days later, another problem surfaced for Derek Mercer. Insurance investigators requested additional documentation connected to the alleged property damage claim. The timing terrified Derek's legal team immediately. Rebecca could tell from the sudden tone shift in communications. Aggressive emails disappeared. Settlement language appeared instead. Blake sat in Rebecca's office reviewing updated filings while she explained the situation. "They're trying to contain collateral damage now." Meaning Derek's worried discovery will spread beyond civil court. Blake nodded slowly. That made sense. Wealthy people feared investigations more than lawsuits, because investigations created records nobody could negotiate quietly. Then came the emails. Rebecca received copies through formal discovery requests tied to communications between Natalie and Derek before the lawsuit filing. Most were heavily sanitized. Professional language, legal coordination. Then one thread changed everything. Rebecca printed it personally and handed it to Blake without speaking at first. The message came from Natalie. "If Blake stays passive, this should settle fast. He hates public conflict." Blake read the line twice, then another message underneath from Derek Good, "Push hard before he finds his spine." The room stayed completely silent after that. Rebecca watched Blake carefully. Most people would have exploded emotionally reading those words. Blake didn't. He simply folded the papers slowly and set them back onto the desk. Rebecca finally spoke. "You okay?" Blake stared toward the office wall. "Yeah." But his voice sounded different now, flatter, because those emails confirmed something painful beneath everything else. Natalie hadn't merely betrayed him emotionally. She had underestimated him personally, completely. That hurt more than Derek Mercer ever could. Later that week, Blake returned home after a 16-hour workday and found another envelope waiting at the duplex. Settlement proposal. Derek Mercer offered withdrawal of all remaining claims in exchange for mutual non-disclosure agreements and termination of further financial discovery. Rebecca laughed openly after reading it. That's panic. Blake sat heavily into the kitchen chair. You think they went from demanding $180,000 to begging you not to keep digging? Blake looked around the quiet duplex. For years, he had eaten exhausted meals at this same kitchen table while Natalie studied nearby, pretending they were building a future together. Now legal settlements replaced dinner conversations. Rebecca continued reading the proposal. No admission of wrongdoing. Confidential resolution. Standard release language. She looked up. They're trying to escape before criminal investigators sniff around further. Blake rubbed both hands across his face slowly. He suddenly looked older than 37. You know what's weird, Rebecca waited. I thought catching them cheating would be the worst part. And Blake looked toward the stack of evidence folders near the counter. It wasn't the cheating. His voice stayed quiet. It was realizing they both thought I was too weak to fight back. Rebecca leaned back slowly. That's because people confuse kindness with weakness all the time. Outside Denver, snow drifted softly across parked cars beneath streetlights. Inside the duplex, years of silence had finally started speaking for Blake Simmons. And every document, every timestamp, every careless email kept saying the same thing. Derek Mercer and Natalie Harper Simmons had built their entire strategy around a man they never truly understood. At the end of the week, Rebecca received formal notice. The court scheduled a final settlement conference before expanded discovery moved forward. Rebecca looked at Blake across her office table. This is the moment where people usually fold. Blake nodded slowly. And if they don't, Rebecca closed the folder carefully. Then this becomes something much bigger than divorce and civil litigation. Blake stared out the office window toward the cold Denver skyline, while evening lights flickered across downtown buildings. For the first time in years, he realized something strange. He no longer felt invisible, and that terrified the people who once depended on him staying quiet. The settlement conference took place on a gray Wednesday morning inside a private mediation office overlooking downtown Denver. Rain tapped softly against the windows, while traffic crawled below through wet streets and lingering snowbanks. Blake Simmons arrived first. Of course he did. He wore the same charcoal suit from the hearing, though this time it fit slightly looser around the shoulders. Over the past month, exhaustion and stress had carved weight off him without permission. Rebecca Sloan noticed immediately. You eating enough? Blake shrugged once, trying. Rebecca handed him coffee before entering the conference room. The room itself looked expensive in a careful corporate way. Dark wood table, leather chairs, abstract art no one actually looked at. A tray of bottled water and untouched pastries sat near the wall. Blake stared at the pastries for a moment. He remembered nights eating vending machine crackers during hospital shifts, while Natalie attended rooftop networking events with Derek Mercer. Strange what the brain held on to. At 9:07 a.m., Derek Mercer arrived with his new attorney. Gone was the effortless confidence Blake had first seen at the charity gala months earlier. Derek still wore expensive suits, still carried himself like a wealthy man. But pressure had changed him. His eyes looked tired now, jaw tighter, movements sharper. The insurance investigation had become very real over the previous week. So had the possibility of expanded fraud review. Blake noticed Derek barely looked at him directly anymore. Interesting. A few minutes later, Natalie Harper Simmons entered quietly behind them. That was the first time Blake truly saw the damage. Not physical damage, professional damage. The polished certainty Natalie used to carry around like perfume was gone. No law firm badge clipped to her bag anymore. No sharp confidence in the way she walked. Blake already knew Barrett, and Klein LLP had quietly terminated her associate position 3 days earlier. Officially, it was called internal restructuring. Everyone involved understood the truth. Natalie sat across from Blake at the mediation table without speaking. The silence between them felt older now, like something already buried. The mediator, Richard Holloway, introduced procedural ground rules in a calm, practiced voice. Confidential discussion. Good faith negotiation. Mutual opportunity for resolution. Blake barely listened. He watched rain sliding down the windows instead. For years, he had imagined legal offices like this as places powerful people controlled outcomes. Now he understood something else. Most people sitting inside rooms like this were just scared. Derek's attorney opened first. Professional tone, measured language. Mr. Mercer wishes to resolve this matter efficiently and privately. Rebecca almost smiled beside Blake, because everyone in the room knew what privately really meant now. Containment, damage control. Derek's attorney continued. All remaining claims would be withdrawn fully. Mutual releases signed. No further litigation pursued. Rebecca folded her hands together. And the financial misconduct concerns we dispute characterization. Rebecca nodded calmly. Of course you do. The mediator stepped in carefully. Perhaps we focus on practical resolution today. Rebecca looked toward Blake once before continuing. Fine. Then practical resolution requires acknowledgement that Mr. Simmons incurred substantial financial harm while financing defendant Harper Simmons's legal education and marital expenses. Natalie lowered her eyes immediately after hearing her own name framed that way. Defendant Harper Simmons. Not Natalie, not wife, not partner. Just legal language now. Rebecca opened one folder. The defense seeks reimbursement structure for documented misuse of marital funds, attorney fees, and equitable asset distribution. Derek leaned forward suddenly. This is insane. His voice carried the first real anger Blake had heard from him. You're trying to ruin people over a relationship. Blake finally looked directly at him. No, Blake said quietly. You tried ruining me over a relationship. The room went silent, because it was true. Derek leaned back again, jaw tight. Rebecca slid settlement documents across the table. Numbers, property allocations, debt responsibility, attorney fees. Natalie stared at the pages without moving. For years, Blake had handled every difficult thing in their lives quietly. Bills, broken cars, tuition deadlines, second jobs. Now Natalie faced consequences alone for the first time in a very long while. The mediator spoke gently. Ms. Harper Simmons, do you have concerns regarding the proposal? Natalie answered without lifting her eyes. No. Derek turned toward her sharply. No, Natalie finally looked up. What exactly do you want me to argue? She asked tiredly. Derek stared at her. Natalie continued quietly. The evidence exists. That sentence changed the room. Not emotionally, strategically. Because Natalie had finally stopped fighting reality itself. Rebecca spoke next. Mr. Simmons is prepared to retain the Aurora property and assume remaining associated maintenance cost. In exchange, Ms. Harper Simmons acknowledges unauthorized marital expenditures connected to plaintiff Mercer. Derek's attorney objected immediately. We are not admitting wrongdoing. Rebecca shrugged slightly. Then we continued discovery. That landed hard, because everyone at the table now understood what continued discovery meant. More emails, more financial tracing, more risk, possibly investigators. Derek rubbed one hand against his forehead aggressively. This whole thing got out of control. Blake almost answered immediately, then stopped, because hearing Derek say that felt strangely pathetic now, like a man's shocked fire became dangerous after pouring gasoline everywhere. The mediator requested a short recess. People scattered quietly around the office. Rebecca stepped into the hallway to take a call. Derek disappeared with his attorney toward another conference room. That left Blake and Natalie briefly alone near the windows overlooking downtown Denver. Rain continued falling steadily outside. Natalie stood beside the glass with arms folded tightly. Blake remained near the table. Neither spoke for almost a full minute. Then Natalie finally said, "You look tired." Blake almost laughed softly at that. "So do you." Natalie nodded faintly. The truth sat openly between them now. No more pretending. No more carefully constructed narratives. Just consequences. Natalie looked out toward the city. "When I first got into law school," she paused, "I really thought we were building something together." Blake answered honestly, "I think we were." Natalie turned toward him slowly. "Then what happened?" Blake considered the question carefully, not because he lacked answers, because he had too many. Finally, he spoke. "You started meeting people who made you ashamed of where you came from." Natalie flinched slightly. "Not denial, recognition." Blake continued quietly. "And eventually, you started looking at me the same way they did." Natalie's eyes watered immediately. "You make it sound so ugly." Blake looked toward the rain-covered windows. It became ugly. That silence afterward felt permanent somehow. Natalie wiped beneath one eye quickly. "I never meant for you to get hurt this badly." Blake studied her for several seconds, then answered with complete honesty, "The cheating hurt." Natalie looked down. "But the lawsuit..." Blake exhaled slowly. "That told me you stopped seeing me as a person." Natalie closed her eyes briefly after hearing that, because deep down she knew it was true. Somewhere along the way, Blake Simmons had become an obstacle to manage instead of a husband to leave honestly. The mediator returned moments later. Then Derek. Then attorneys. Back to paperwork. Back to numbers. By late afternoon, the settlement finally finalized. Derek Mercer formally withdrew all remaining claims against Blake Simmons. He agreed to pay a substantial portion of Blake's attorney fees. Natalie accepted equitable debt allocation tied to misused marital funds. Blake retained the Aurora duplex and several remaining joint assets. No dramatic courtroom victory, no screaming, no revenge speech, just signatures, one by one. At the very end, everyone stood slowly from the table. Chairs slid softly across polished floors. Documents disappeared into briefcases. Lives separated into legal categories. Natalie lingered near the doorway while the others left. Blake gathered his folders carefully, the same way he always handled important things. Before walking out, Natalie spoke one final time. "Blake." He looked up. Her eyes looked red now, exhausted, human again. "Did you ever stop loving me?" The question hung quietly between them, while rain struck the windows behind her. Blake thought about the cafe in Colorado Springs, the frozen duplex winters, the years of overtime, the law textbooks, the lies, the courtroom, the evidence. Then he looked at the woman standing in front of him now, and realized the answer was far more complicated than either of them deserved. KKT Thukes, PHN 14, PHN 15. Blake Simmons looked at Natalie Harper Simmons for a long moment before answering her question. Rain slid down the mediation office windows behind her, while downtown Denver disappeared beneath gray evening clouds. "Did you ever stop loving me?" The room felt very still after she asked it. Blake stood beside the conference table holding the same worn document folder he had carried into courtrooms and legal offices for months now. For years, those hands carried tools. Now they carried evidence. Funny how life changed. Finally, Blake answered quietly, "I think I stopped recognizing you first." Natalie's eyes filled immediately. Not dramatic crying, just exhaustion finally breaking through. Blake didn't stay to watch it. He picked up the folder, nodded once toward Rebecca Sloan, and walked out of the mediation office into the cold Denver evening. Outside rain mixed with melting snow along the sidewalks. Traffic lights reflected across wet pavement while people hurried beneath umbrellas toward restaurants, parking garages, and apartment buildings. Normal lives. Blake stood under the building awning for several seconds, breathing cold air into tired lungs. Then he climbed into the old Ford Ranger. The engine struggled twice before turning over. That sound made him smile faintly for the first time in weeks. The truck still had problems, but at least it was honest about them. 3 months later, Denver entered early spring. Snow finally disappeared from most streets except shaded corners and parking lots where winter always lingered longer. Life became quieter for Blake Simmons. Not easier immediately, but quieter. The lawsuit was gone. The divorce finalized. The ethics investigation involving Natalie remained ongoing, though Rebecca warned Blake not to follow updates too closely. "You don't live there anymore," she told him one afternoon. That sentence mattered more than she realized, because for years Blake had lived inside survival mode. Work, bills, stress, suspicion, documentation. Now suddenly there was empty space where constant pressure used to be. At first he didn't know what to do with it. Blake cut back from 4 jobs to 2. The FedEx loading shift disappeared first. Then the Sunday car washing work. For the first time in nearly 7 years, Blake slept through an entire Saturday morning without setting alarms. When he woke up around 9:30 a.m., sunlight filled the duplex kitchen quietly. No legal paperwork on the table, no unopened court envelopes, no anxiety sitting in his chest before his eyes even opened. Just silence. Real silence. Blake stood barefoot in the kitchen making coffee slowly while old rock music played softly from a radio near the sink. That morning he realized something strange. He couldn't remember the last time he existed inside his own life instead of simply enduring it. A month later, Blake used part of the settlement funds and years of HVAC experience to do something he had postponed for most of adulthood. He opened his own repair business, Simmons Heating and Air Repair. The logo looked simple on the side of the used white service van he bought from a retiring contractor in Aurora. No fancy branding, no investors, just honest work. Blake spent evenings repairing the van himself in the driveway while neighbors occasionally stopped to talk. People treated him differently now, not because of the lawsuit. Most never knew details. They simply noticed something calmer in him, lighter. Even the hospital staff at St. Vincent commented on it. One nurse told him, "You smile more now." Blake hadn't realized that was true. The old Ford Ranger remained parked beside the duplex most nights. He couldn't bring himself to sell it. Too many years lived inside that truck. Too many frozen mornings. Too many quiet drives home after overnight shifts while Denver woke around him. So instead, Blake repaired it gradually. New transmission, fresh paint, rebuilt heater system. Small things, patient things, the same way he rebuilt himself. One cool April evening, Rebecca Sloan visited the duplex after work, carrying takeout containers from a barbecue place near Capitol Hill. Blake opened the door, wearing jeans stained with motor oil. Thought lawyers only ate expensive salads, he said. Rebecca snorted once. Thought HVAC guys only drank gas station coffee. They sat on the back porch eating brisket while evening sunlight faded across Aurora rooftops. For the first time since meeting her, Blake saw Rebecca genuinely relaxed. No legal pads, no case files, just quiet conversation. Eventually, Rebecca set down her drink. "You want the update?" Blake already knew what she meant. Derek Rebecca nodded. "Insurance investigators expanded review." She paused. "There may be fraud charges eventually." Blake absorbed the information silently, and Natalie Rebecca looked at him carefully. "She's negotiating disciplinary measures with the ethics board." Blake stared out toward the fading sky. Part of him expected satisfaction hearing that. Victory, maybe. Instead, he mostly felt distant from it now. like hearing news about strangers connected to a previous version of his life. Rebecca noticed, "You don't care anymore." Blake thought about the question honestly, then shrugged slightly. "I cared when I thought I needed them to understand what they did." Rebecca waited, but eventually, Blake rubbed one hand across his jaw slowly. "You get tired carrying anger too." The porch fell quiet after that. Wind moved softly through nearby trees while traffic hummed faintly in the distance. Rebecca finally smiled slightly. "You know something." "What?" "When you first walked into my office, I thought you were another exhausted guy about to get destroyed in court." Blake laughed quietly. "Fair assumption." Rebecca shook her head once. "No. The scary part was you never tried destroying anyone back." Blake looked toward the driveway where the repaired Ford Ranger sat beneath the porch light. "I just wanted the truth somewhere permanent." Rebecca nodded slowly. "And you got it." Later that night, after Rebecca left, Blake stayed outside alone with a mug of coffee warming his hands. Spring air drifted cool across the neighborhood. The duplex looked different now. Not smaller, not sadder, just his. Inside sat no hidden folders anymore. No secret evidence boxes beneath furnaces. No anxiety waiting in kitchen drawers. Blake had finally stopped documenting survival. Now he was living again instead. His phone buzzed once around 10:40 p.m. Unknown number. Blake ignored it initially. Then another message appeared. "Natalie." Only 3 words. "I'm sorry." Blake stared at the screen for a long time, then locked the phone without replying. Not because he hated her, not because forgiveness was impossible, but because some stories ended long before the final apology arrived. Blake leaned back in the porch chair and looked out across the quiet Colorado night. The old Ford Ranger sat restored beneath the street light. The service van carried his company logo now. Inside the duplex waited tomorrow's invoices, repair schedules, and ordinary life. And for the first time in years, ordinary felt enough. Blake lifted the coffee mug, slowly breathing steam into the cold spring air, while Denver lights flickered faintly in the distance. People once looked at him and saw a tired maintenance worker. Forgettable, replaceable, easy to outgrow. What they never understood was that quiet men spent years learning how to carry weight without collapsing. And once they finally set that weight down, they rarely picked up the same chains again. Life has a strange way of revealing people slowly. Sometimes betrayal doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in small changes, different tones, hidden receipts, quiet disrespect. And by the time the truth fully surfaces, the damage has already been growing for years. But stories like Blake Simmons's remind people of something important. Calm does not mean weak. Silence does not mean blind. Some people survive by observing, carefully documenting quietly, and refusing to let emotion destroy their judgment. In the end, it wasn't money, anger, or revenge that protected Blake. It was patience, evidence, discipline, and the decision to stay steady while everyone else underestimated him. If you've ever worked hard for someone who later acted ashamed of your sacrifices, or if you've ever been treated like you were too ordinary to matter, then you probably understand this story better than most. So tell me honestly in the comments, what would you have done if the person you sacrificed everything for used their success against you? And if you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel now. Tomorrow's story might hit even closer to home.